Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Guy Page is joining me today as a co-host. Guy, welcome.
Thank you.
And we have a very interesting subject, if not a little disturbing, Bethanee. Our guest is Bethanee Syverson, who is the executive director of Expose. Okay. And the topic tonight is the road to a safer Vermont, and we'll talk about the details in just a minute. I wanted to introduce Bethanee by talking a little bit about her introduction. Bethanee is a well-known national speaker who provides encouragement to women and educates groups on sexual exploitation and pornography and speaking out about the struggles with infertility. In a few minutes, we will introduce the topics we are going to discuss with Bethanee today about Vermont and the road to a safer Vermont. Oof. I don't know, Bethanee. Anyway, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so just personally?
Yeah.
So I'm married almost 24 years in January, and I have 6 kids, 4 biological kids and 2 adopted, twin 5-year-olds. So we have 20 down to twin 5-year-olds, so it's a little crazy at our house. I homeschool I homeschool all the kids, first grade through 8th grade, and then we send them to
high school.
Yeah, to the high school. So I've got 2 in college. I went to the University of Maine, which is where I met my husband, and then we moved to New Hampshire, where we've resided since '98. And in 2007 or 8, I can't remember, an incident happened on our tiny little quiet cul-de-sac street in our super tiny town in New Hampshire, which introduced me to the topic that we'll be talking about today. And it was, can I say? Or?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
Just say it out.
Okay. So, the FBI and 5 local law enforcement towns and SWAT teams and everything swarmed our tiny little cul-de-sac street of like 8 houses, and we were totally taken off guard and didn't know what was going on. And we ended up finding out that the little girl next door, it was a couple, they weren't married, and it was her children from her previous relationship, and she would work at 3rd shift as a nurse, and while she was working 3rd shift as a nurse, her boyfriend began sexually assaulting her 11-year-old at the time, which was her middle child. And then sexual assault is different than the topic that we're talking about, which is sex trafficking and prostitution, which is eventually what he ended up doing to her. Over the course of 2.5 years, he uploaded countless videos to pedophile websites.
Of the little girl.
Yeah, of him abusing her. And then he eventually trafficked her into Concord, our state's capital, and as he trafficked her, he allowed other men to rape her. He would film that and then upload that to pedophile websites. So that's how I got involved in this as a mother of many children, although at the time I think I had 3 kids, but as a mother of many children, I was so horrified that, one, this was happening at all. I had never even heard the conversation about human trafficking or anything. But even just that I didn't know about it, that I felt like I should have been able to stop it. And in hindsight, I don't think I really could have. I've learned all the red flags, and now I speak all over, teaching people about this. But it was the catalyst that got me started in this. So. Well,
thank you. I mean, seriously, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And the FBI must have gotten involved because he used the internet.
Yes.
To cross state lines or whatever.
Yeah, so that's what I do. I work a lot legislatively now in New Hampshire, attending hearings, helping senators write bills and stuff like that. And I'll be doing a lot more of that in this legislative session. But because I had asked the Assistant Attorney General, so why wasn't he prosecuted under human trafficking laws? And he said, our laws in New Hampshire are just not strong enough. He would have gotten a slap on the wrist. But we were able, he said, and these are his exact words, there was more than one way to skin a cat. He said, we were able to get him in prison for 40 life sentences, because for every single time he uploaded child pornography, which is now known as child sexual abuse material, CSAM. So every time he uploaded CSAM to the internet, they were able to prosecute him on all of those.
Yeah.
But if he hadn't?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So our laws are
And
very
and
weak.
you must have known the little girl. You didn't have any clue that.
We were not close. Our children were much younger at the time, and so our families didn't really hang out. They just also different group of people, right? They were partiers, drinkers.
Yeah.
My husband and I are just not that, you know.
Right.
We just don't do
have
that.
Time with 6 kids.
Yeah. So just not people we would have hung out with in general.
right.
But I'm a runner, and I would run past the 3 daughters at the bus stop every morning, well, at the end of their driveway,
Yeah.
you know, and I would wave to them, and they would all wave and look
Yeah.
happy, and, you know, like everything was
Mom
okay.
if Mom didn't know, I'm sure she
Mom
must
did not know.
and being a nurse, she must have been triply appalled.
Yeah, she was horrified.
Oh, I can't
and
even
when he
imagine.
went off to prison, her and her father and mother and friends went in and completely demolished the house
Right.
that was under his name. So probably had
Wow.
broken a few laws themselves, but as a mother, I was like, you
That's
do
like,
it.
go for
I
it.
don't even care.
Yeah,
Break
really.
my heart.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, exactly.
So, there was some stuff on your website and the information you sent me. One of those was a package that was entitled "The Road to a Safer Vermont." Why do we have a package that says "The Road to a Safer Vermont"?
So Vermont, in the last legislative session, the one that just ended, and there was an introduction of 3 bills: House Bill 568,
Right.
House Bill 569, and Senate Bill 217. Senate Bill 217 and House Bill 569 are mostly
The same.
identical.
Yeah, companion bills.
But if it doesn't pass in the House, they're hoping it will pass in the Senate. And 568 was a study bill, and that is very strategically done. They'll oftentimes put a study bill before a bill that is pretty egregious.
Right.
And so they put forth a study bill to study whether or not there are harmful effects to fully legalizing and decriminalizing prostitution, which is what these bills were about. The state of Vermont, or the sponsors of this bill, would like to fully legalize and decriminalize prostitution.
Do you know the sponsors of these bills, the chief names here? Do you know them by any
I
names?
should know that.
No, and I should too, and I apologize.
I know
Do you
Cillian
them?
Coburn of Burlington is one of them.
Really?
Is one of the lead sponsors, yes.
And they had to study whether this will do harm, as I laugh hysterically. It doesn't.
Well, they haven't had the study yet. They voted almost unanimously in the House, and in. Again, I'm not super political, even though I do some
No, you're
do some
doing
legislative
fine.
work in New
Yeah.
Hampshire, so I may get terminology wrong, but kind of like in the middle of the night passage of House Bill 568. I'm guessing that just means kind of covertly it was passed. There was no hearing, there was no testifying that was allowed to be done. There was nothing. It just passed almost unanimously in the House to have a study done. And so the study had not been done because COVID hit, and and again, politically, I don't know how it works. It had passed in the House. I think doesn't have to cross,
Has to go
and
to the Senate.
it didn't even get to that point because when COVID hit and everything
Yeah,
shut
so
down.
it actually legally has to start. All those bills have to start over this year.
Exactly. And so I had spoken with somebody, a colleague of mine in Washington, D.C., who helps me out with some of this terminology and all that kind of stuff. And I had asked her, I said, so what happens? And so she did tell me that in Vermont, in all states, but things that didn't pass, like these bills, they're fully expecting them to come back on the table. And they will all have different names, different
Right,
house numbers,
right,
she
right.
said, based on when they're reintroduced.
Yeah.
So the numbers will change, but we have no doubt that it's going to be back on the floor.
But,
So
well, go ahead.
none of the bills passed.
No, they
into
just
law.
went to their own House
Okay.
and Senate, and they stayed there. The Senate bill didn't. pass.
569 never even got heard, and
Oh,
neither
right.
neither did 217.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for viewers, this is a new biennium starting January, and any bill that didn't make it through the last 2 years, you have to start it over. And as Bethanie's saying, maybe new name, new number, and then you start the process all over again, right?
That's right.
There's no way to hold it over unless they do a notwithstanding or some sneaky thing, but I don't think so.
Right.
I don't think they're allowed. So what is their rationale for accepting This is about prostitution.
Yeah.
Are we worried about the prostitutes?
So you're saying the rationale of those wanting to pass the bill?
Right. What's the benefit to Vermonters?
So they've cleverly passed it, or passed it off as a title of sex work, right? So it's work. People can choose to work. You can choose to go to your job. I can choose to go to my job. This is their job, and therefore it should be completely legal and decriminalized, because if she's choosing to go to work and this is her job, why can't she do that without legal
Right.
So from that perspective, from the perspective of the person being prostituted, all of us, my allies, my colleagues, we all are like, absolutely. A person, and I say person because there are men that are prostituted and trafficked as well. Right. Overwhelmingly, we know it's women. But a person being prostituted and trafficked, we do not believe they should be criminalized and penalized. We do not think that they should have a record. If they're trying to get out of the life, if they're trying to get away from their traffickers, away from their pimps, and they're trying to get a clean start, go back to school, get a job, if they have this, for things that were not even, they didn't have a choice on, right? They shouldn't be penalized. However, these bills and the sponsors of these bills and the people backing this entire movement across the country, they're framing it as it's empowering for women. It should be my right as a woman to choose sex work and to sell my body and to give sexual services if that's my prerogative. It's sexual and personal autonomy. That is what the thinking is.
Is this the women's right?
It is, yes, and many others, which I'm not going to name here, but yes, and so that's kind of their general thought process. Right. So the counter to that, what my colleagues and I counter with, is the fact that anytime there is an exchange for money, you've lost autonomy. You cannot be autonomous in your decisions when there is an exchange for sex, any sexual act for money.
Right.
And we see this, and you can look to Las Vegas, to Nevada, where they have, in Las Vegas proper, the city, legalized prostitution. Prostitution is illegal within the city of Las Vegas, but within 7 counties outside of the city, prostitution is legalized. And what we know, just looking at Las Vegas, Nevada, who has had legalized prostitution for 49 years, we have seen, and there's anecdotal evidence of this now, that there is an increase in domestic violence towards women. There's an increase of that domestic violence leading to murder. So Nevada has a 60% higher rate than the next highest state, which is New York City or New York. A 60% higher rate of domestic violence that turns to murder than any other state in our country. We have there are stats that talk about abortion, which we won't talk about, but it increases abortion. It increases the demand for. It increases sex trafficking, right, which is only slightly different than prostitution. Prostitution really falls under sex trafficking, right? Right. So you are being sex trafficked if you're exchanging any kind of sexual services for money, and that, of course, would include prostitution. So it increases. You cannot have legalized prostitution and not have an increase of sex trafficking, rather.
You didn't mention sexually transmitted diseases. I'm assuming that's
yes. So what's interesting is in Nevada, it is the burden of the prostitutes to go and get weekly testing done at their own cost. So they're being trafficked, they're being raped, strangled, beaten, at the mercy of whatever a predominantly male dominated,
right.
purchasers want to do. So in exchange for money, they now believe that her body is his commodity. It is his object to do whatever he wants to do with. And as a result, all these horrible things happen, and to include sometimes STDs. But even though all of that has occurred, she bears the burden, according to the state of Nevada, to have to go get tested once a week, and she has to bear the cost of that. Now, you have to realize that within the cost of that, oftentimes, and this becomes a 13th Amendment issue, which the 13th Amendment was, dealing with slavery, slavery of old, but really it talked about debt bondage and, no person has the right to have ownership over any one person. Well, that's exactly what pimps and brothel owners do.
Right.
They have ownership over a woman and her body and also all of her money. So in the legalized prostitution in Nevada, if a woman is in a brothel, so there's a survivor named Rebecca Charleston. Rebecca was trafficked through the legal brothels in Nevada, but she had a pimp, a trafficker, who would traffic her. And if she didn't bring in enough money,
right.
he would send her to be disciplined by sending her to the brothels, because the legalized brothels in Las Vegas, in Nevada, would make her work harder and harder. And so, but she then had to give 50% of all of her money to the brothel owner. Then when she gets back to her pimp, she has to give the remaining money to the pimp. So she's left with no money, and yet at the same time, she has to go and get weekly STD testing. It's just crazy. So it's not empowering to women whatsoever. And it's touted as this incredibly empowering thing for women, but when women are being abused and strangled and raped and tortured and all kinds, and completely dehumanized, that's not empowering on any level.
Guy, you want to pitch in here?
Sure. So
He's right.
Basically, I know they're well funded, the marijuana folks. Certainly a lot of the medical marijuana people. There's even supposedly some Russian oligarch money behind some of them. Now, so why would wanting to have legal retail pot somehow help prostitution efforts? I don't get it.
Well, I don't think it helps prostitution efforts per se, but I think it helps the legalization of marijuana. And
right.
The theory that I've heard is that because with an increase in prostitution, there is always an increase in crime.
Right.
Drug trafficking, arms trafficking, street crime. There's just an increase in crime as a whole. And with an increase of crime, you have an increase of people that are looking for drugs. And if marijuana can be legal and be one of those legal drugs, then that's all the better for Vermont.
Right.
We can legalize prostitution and we can legalize marijuana. And both would be legal.
Bethanee, when we were started talking about the road to safer Vermont, which leads me to think that we may have some issues here in our state.
Yeah. So obviously the road to a safer Vermont would be to educate people and help them to understand to not pass the bills.
Do we have any or all of these issues here in Vermont? And I'm once again living in my cone of silence and I don't see this stuff.
Yes, so I was on a Zoom meeting, which I think, Guy, you might have been on as well, with a detective. I'm blanking on his name. I think his first name was Matt, but anyhow, and he was talking about, I think, how last year there were 250, I have a terrible memory for facts and stats and stuff. I think there was like 250 survivors of trafficking that were, rescued here in Vermont.
Really?
I have some information from a different detective, which I am not at liberty to share, but there's an entire ring that they know about and that they're working on. And so from that perspective, absolutely. I just, and like I said, I'm not at liberty to.
It's here.
It's here. It's very much here. I work with a survivor who lives in Maine, and she was trafficked as a 15-year-old girl through New England, but specifically here to Vermont. And the things that happened to her here in Vermont are so horrific that we have, as colleagues and as allies, have decided she offered to come and speak here in Vermont multiple times, but after offering that, after a Zoom meeting, she was in tears and she said, I just don't think I can relive that over and over again. So we asked her if she would be willing to do a video. So we have this really well done video.
Really?
So that people can hear her
Is that
story.
open that we could have?
Yes, yep.
Oh,
I
would
can
like
get
to
that
get a
video.
hold of it.
Yeah, I can
please.
get that video to you.
We could
Definitely.
follow this up with that video.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Bethany, I remember reading a few months ago that in Burlington, the federal courts put away a pimp who said, oh no, I'm not making these women do anything. I'm just helping them. This is what they want to do. I haven't forced anyone to do anything. Now, it seems to me that a pimp generally has a lot more influence over a woman than that. Can you tell us a bit about what's sort of the mindset that happens between a pimp and a prostitute?
So the argument that I always hear first is, well, what if she walked into it? What if she chose that lifestyle?
Right.
And it's crazy that that's usually the first argument that I hear. But let me paint a picture for you. You are a child of the foster care system. You age out of the system. You are now homeless. You have no stable life, no stable background. You have nothing. You have nothing to your name. You are now a legal adult, and now you're living on the streets. You have nothing,
Right.
no means for anything.
That's a problem here in Vermont.
And so what happens, oftentimes, or sometimes, these girls will either choose that lifestyle, or they will be solicited by a pimp who can see a girl homeless on the street, right? And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll go up and this is what human trafficking as a whole looks like in the United States. So human trafficking, prostitution, prostitution again is under human trafficking. This is what it looks like as a whole, though. Where the movie Human Trafficking or Taken is not really what it looks like here in the United States, where a girl is just kidnapped violently and forced to go do stuff. What it looks like here in the United States is what I was about ready to explain, which is you have this vulnerable population of people. Maybe they're not even a product of the foster care system. Maybe they just grew up in a really bad home where there was sexual abuse and drug addiction, all kinds of stuff, right? You have this vulnerable population, and now they're either out on the streets because they ran away. I mean, the average age of entry, and it's argued, and I don't like giving straight hard facts because they can be, there's a window, but is between 12 and 14 years old is the average age of entry into prostitution. So a 12-year-old, right, 13-year-old, a 14-year-old is being solicited on the streets by a guy who might see her walking around and suspect that maybe she had run away or she's homeless, and will offer her, hey, I can take care of you. I can give you a place to stay. I can give you some food. Are you hungry? Let's go get a hamburger at McDonald's or whatever. And he'll go and he'll do those kind of nice things to make her feel safe and secure. Now let's keep that in the back of your mind. Now let's just take a totally separate situation. Let's take the average child at home, good family, bad family, mediocre family, and they have access to social media. Horrific. It is such a privilege of mine to be able to educate parents on safe social media usage, and it is also at the same time just horrifying to me to realize the amount of social media that parents allow their children to have. Right. And the reason why is because you have these young kids, and they don't understand boundaries. They don't understand that they shouldn't share certain things. They shouldn't share what school they go to. They shouldn't share, oh, I just got in a fight with my mom and dad, and I hate my parents, and, I just want to run away from home. Because those are all red flags, and pedophiles and predators who are online will take all of those things, because a lot of these kids have their social media accounts wide open. They're not locked down so only a few of their friends can see it. It's wide open to the entire internet. And then those pedophiles and those predators and pimps and traffickers, they'll see those, and then they'll start private messaging them. Right. And then what that looks like is they befriend them, and they're patient because they know that they can win these girls, especially the vulnerable population. And again, sometimes boys are under underserved in this topic. Trafficking and prostitution does happen to boys as well, and they don't get enough.
We don't focus on them enough.
Enough, yes. I mean, predominantly it is still females,
right.
but yes, I do want to mention that it does happen to young boys as well, and adult men. But you have these kids now, and they're willing to be patient. Just befriend them.
Right, just reel them in slowly.
Absolutely. And then something will come like, hey, there's like a bunch of different scenarios. It could be, you and I can go away, we can get our own apartment together, but we need some money. If you just could take some nude pictures of yourself, we could sell those, and then, or if you would just be willing to have sex with, I've got like 3 guys, and then you won't ever have to do it again, and then that will get us money for. And they'll say things like that, but then what happens is they take pictures and they take videos, and then they use that to force fraud and coercion into, and what they'll say is, well, if you don't do these things, I now have all these pictures, I now have all these videos, I'm gonna show them to your family, I'm gonna put them out in your school, all of your friends are gonna see what you really are. And that happens to both of those scenarios. That is the predominant way we see trafficking and exploitation in the United States.
If these 3 bills pass, will your scenario and guys about the guy in Cortez, they won't be held accountable because this makes it legal?
So, I mean, minors, any kind of sexual encounters with minors is automatically counted as human trafficking.
Oh, okay.
So from that,
no matter with these bills.
No matter with those bills, it is still counted as human trafficking. So the bills would be aiming at people 18 and older. And so the pimps and the traffickers will target high schools. Now, I want to also say, so here's what happens. If prostitution is fully legalized and decriminalized, this is what happens. This is what it looks like, fully decriminalized and legalized. If it is fully legalized and decriminalized, it is now considered any old job, right? So what happens at your child's high school or middle school or elementary school when what day comes?
Job fair day?
Job fair day.
Oh my gosh.
And career day. Guess who is legally allowed, and this is happening in Nevada, who is legally allowed to go into your schools and tout, hey, come and work for me. Great job, great pay, pay off any. Yeah, and it is absolutely
things I'm not good at talking about.
It is absolutely legal. It would also make it absolutely legal for brothel owners and pimps and traffickers to be able to be the gymnastics coach and the basketball coach and the cross country coach and all that kind of stuff. It would also make it completely legal for them to hold any government position in your state, which is happening in Nevada. There's a man who sits as the commissioner remember how I said there's 7 counties? In one of the counties, the one that has the most brothels, he sits as the commissioner who makes all of the, now this is where I'm going to get lost on the political stuff, on the terminology, who makes all of the, like the rules and stuff for the legal brothels.
Wonderful job.
Right?
Bet their
Crazy.
Kids are proud of Dad.
Right.
Yeah, wow.
So that's what happens, right? We legalize it.
I can imagine our legislature would also like these women to have medical benefits and unemployment and stuff.
I mean, they would be legally allowed to have all of those if it becomes legalized because it's touted as a full job.
Now, you talked about having a plan for Vermont on how to maybe avoid all this or to educate people to not have this happen here. Could you talk a little bit about, I think you called it the plan of action, and then you talked about something called the equity model, and maybe we could talk about that.
Yeah, so it's the equality model. The equality model basically says, and there's a website, equalitymodelus.org, I think is what it is. And the equality model basically says that we want to legalize, we want to not see women and men that are being prostituted. We don't want to see them criminalized. So that's the first part of it. The second part of the equality model is that we want to see all other aspects of prostitution illegal. I don't know what the words. we want to see all other aspects illegal. So we want to see Johns, which are the buyers, we want to see them prosecuted. We want to see pimps, brothel owners, traffickers, we want to see all of them prosecuted. We want to see it illegal to have brothels in our states, again, because what happens if this bill passes? You live in a quaint little suburban town and your next door neighbor is running a full legal brothel. Well, guess what happens at legal brothels? There's drugs, there's guns, there's violence, there's prostitution, all happening in your little quiet, next door neighbor. Or take your beautiful capital city here, right? Your kids and the people that are walking on the streets will now be faced at and looking at legal street walking, brothels, people hanging out on the doorsteps of the brothels right here in your downtown areas, right? It would be terrible. So what we want to see is an action plan that will begin to educate Vermonters about what these package of bills are aiming to do. Because again, the other side is backed by a lot of money. And for us on this side of it, we're all very small nonprofit organizations fighting to just see an end of sexual exploitation as a whole in our country. We don't have any money. We're just doing I'm doing this for free, coming from New Hampshire. I drove on my own dime, whatever. But I'm willing to do that because I know that the downside is so bad for Vermont, and that will spill over into New Hampshire. And, it's terrible for us. And so we need to begin educating the public. This is a great way. But you guys can hold house parties. We could do Zoom meetings. I can get you that video and you guys can play that and play it more than once, right? Because there's going to be viewers who aren't going to see it the first or the second time, things like that. I can come and I can speak at churches. Zoom meetings, churches. I did a Rotary Club meeting in Bar City a few weeks ago with a nice gentleman there. And then, so any of those kind of things, but it's really...
Expose. This is your group?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And you're just all volunteers, because that's actually when... I remember we had a woman on, and she was from a group when marijuana first started here, and they were all volunteers, and she was particularly, because she had a personal issue with it and could tell some personal stories. I find our legislature, if they want this, and there's money involved, you're going to have to find, are there horrendous stories out there that can be proven that this state tried it and here's what happened? Of course, they didn't pay attention to any marijuana stories either.
We can look very easily to Nevada. Nevada is the only state in our entire country that has legalized prostitution.
Oh, great, and we're going to be the next?
You're set to be the next if you pass it,
I'm so sick of us being the bleeding edge for all of this junk.
Well, they tried in New Hampshire, the same exact group. They tried in New Hampshire for the last 3 legislative sessions. Well, 3, not this past one, the 3 before that one. And I think they finally just got tired because there's a small but fierce group of us in New Hampshire that are fighting. And so, what we think is they picked up and said, all right, well, let's drop New Hampshire for a minute and let's go to Vermont. We're certain that it's going to pass in Vermont, and then once it passes in Vermont, New Hampshire, they'll pass it. And so that's what we believe is happening. Again, it's kind of a theory, but it's what we think is kind of down the line. So selfishly, I'm here in Vermont because I don't want to see it pass here in Vermont, but because I don't want to see it spill over into New Hampshire either. My kids are growing up in New Hampshire, but I care about the kids in Vermont. I care about the kids in the United States. And Vermont is not the only state that is currently trying to pass it. New Hampshire tried to pass it for 3 sessions. Vermont currently, Colorado, Louisiana, and California, and it's like 5 or 7 other states that are trying to pass this package of bills. But I would not at all be surprised to find out in this new legislative session that we're going to have an explosion of states that are trying to pass it.
Bethanee, California just passed a law basically allowing consensual sex with a child 10 years younger than the adult.
Yeah, it's
So
deplorable.
basically you
Who's
could have...
consenting? The parent of the child or the child?
Oh, no, the child.
The child can make up their mind?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so a
12 years
10-year-old.
old with a 22-year-old.
Yeah.
And that's all good, according to California now.
Yeah, it's deplorable.
Well, it's crazy. But it would seem to me that if you have that sort of, we're fine with children having sex, boy, does that ever open the door to child prostitution legalization.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
Yep.
That's horrible.
We must not talk morals, but I think we're losing ours. It's really sad that they look at Vermont as a place to start all this stuff, and we say, "Oh, good idea." What can we do for the kids who are in the state's custody, and then just let loose? I've always been worried about those kids, and I thought they were trying to do something to minimize that shock, but.
So, I mean, I'm going to be the first to say, I don't know on a statewide level what needs to happen as far as once they're out. I mean, that's not really my field. But I will say that if you have people that feel passionate about this topic and they want to get educated, this is what I do in New Hampshire. I go to the group homes in New Hampshire and I train these kids. You are the highest vulnerable population out of all of the kids, are you kids. And even within that, the higher population within foster care are children of ethnic, different various ethnic backgrounds.
Right.
So I go in and I just try to educate them and say, listen, you have to understand this is what's waiting for you when you come out. Even kids that are in the youth prison, we have seen this across the country. When kids get out, again, kids that come out of youth prisons, as an example, oftentimes are coming from very broken homes or from foster care, right? And so they don't have parents that are lovingly picking them up from prison. They're oftentimes let out and they're walking down the street because they don't have.
Came in with.
Exactly, they don't have anybody picking them up, and so we know that traffickers will wait. Along the streets and stuff like that of the youth prisons waiting for, but this is in much larger, more densely populated areas. We haven't really seen this necessarily in New Hampshire, but in more densely populated cities, we know that they're waiting for these kids. Again, they're super vulnerable.
Yeah.
Are you saying that minorities are more susceptible to this than whites?
Yes, minorities across the board. If human trafficking, 10 to 12 years ago, human trafficking was a topic of its own. But as we've learned over the last decade and a half, it really is like, it's the umbrella for things like pornography, stripping, prostitution, sex work, any of that kind of stuff. And the most vulnerable population under that entire umbrella are people of different ethnic backgrounds.
Why?
I don't know that I want to speculate on that. I guess to some extent we know that their economic situation is worse off than
poor families.
So they come from rougher neighborhoods. And again, not categorically. I don't want to get myself in trouble, but just as in our nation. But it's Anyhow, I was going to go off on a.
So the impact of this is that in perhaps the name of fighting systemic injustice or something, this could actually perpetuate actual prostitution among ethnic minorities.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
I was hung up on the street walking, and going right into the smoking parlors we're going to have now for marijuana.
Yeah.
And people approaching people in cars. That'll be lovely.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
God, this is incredible.
So Rhode Island had legalized and fully decriminalized prostitution for, again, bad at numbers and stats. I think it was roughly around 20 years. And what they saw is exactly what we know is going to happen in Vermont, what we know is going to happen in New Hampshire. It's what is happening in Nevada. It turned Providence into a war zone. I mean, the amount of crime and drugs, the amount of abuse, the amount of street activity and stuff like that, the amount of crime that just it's side crime, right? The people that are constantly out there buying sex are, sometimes not your best members
Have
of society.
you spoken to our state police or any of our local?
They are, and
Yeah.
and there's like I said, there's one guy that I've been on a few Zoom calls with and stuff, and he is very passionate about
Okay,
it.
I
And
have to check that out.
yeah, and he
find out.
works in their anti-trafficking department
okay.
of their.
I'm assuming it's
Police.
state police, because we had Commissioner Sherling on a week or so ago, and we sort of, I didn't realize how deep we should have gone into this. We sort of scooted around it, but I know he kind of perked up on that one. It's just incredible, because I would think, I mean, the war of drugs here is just incredible. Our issues with opioid, and one leads to the other.
Yeah, right.
The opioid crisis, I mean, we haven't talked much about it in the pandemic, but it hasn't gotten any better.
It's gotten worse.
It's gotten worse because
Yeah.
people
We
don't
know
know what
it's
to do
gotten
with their
worse.
time.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and I'm sure, and I know that child abuse, the
CSAM has gone up,
everything,
child abuse,
everything's
domestic
gone up.
violence,
Yep.
yeah, all of that
these
has
kids
gone
have no
up.
place to go.
And nobody has eyes on them at all.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
I would think, and then, well, I was trying not to talk about abortion, but obviously that's a byproduct of this industry.
It is,
That's
yeah.
an industry.
Oftentimes the traffickers will, if a woman gets pregnant, obviously that would hurt his bottom dollar.
Right.
And so he'll oftentimes go and force the women to get abortions.
Right.
Yeah. So abortion increases as we see prostitution increase.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so who would be their employer? It depends if they're independent or they're in a
Well,
brothel.
so I
or
mean, if
are
it's
they gonna be an
legalized, the
employee
brothel.
employer?
I mean, yeah, if it's a brothel, then the brothel would be their employer.
Right.
Just like girls that are trafficked and employed through a strip club. It's
Right,
the strip
right.
club that.
So
but
this
like,
is a real business, so that they would be required to be the employer.
yeah, but what's crazy again, talking about the victim having to bear the brunt of the burden of
Right.
proving things. I was on a webinar with several survivors and some colleagues of mine from DC, and one of the survivors who was trafficked through the legal brothel system in Nevada, she was talking about her tax ramifications because she was trafficked. And when you're being trafficked and you're using drugs to cope with, the horrific abuse that's happening to you. Again, I actually know a survivor that her pimp never wanted them to use drugs. So not all, you will use drugs, but many will use drugs just to cope with
Sure,
the
get
amount
through
of
the
trauma
day,
that
right.
is happening to them. So, but whatever, even if there's no drugs, but their life is just not as such that when they get tips that they're writing down, and so she owes a tremendous amount of tax debt that she's having to pay off
right.
for all of the times that she was trafficked throughout this country into strip clubs. Again, she was doing that against her will. She was being trafficked into these strip clubs across the country. So her burden of proof now is that she has to try to remember every single strip club that she was trafficked into, get 1099s from them so she can prove to the federal government that this is what I made and whatever. But until she completes that, she owes all this back tax.
Who
It's
is
just
doing this? The
crazy.
IRS or someone is doing this?
The
Or?
federal government on some level, yeah, whoever, I would assume it's the
Wow.
IRS. Yeah.
Insult to injury.
They would.
Excuse that?
Yeah, you
yeah.
think?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So the woman you were talking about in Maine.
Yeah.
She said it was 14, 15 here.
She was 15, yeah.
Did she live here or did she
She
come
lived
from
in Maine and he would traffic her into
over
Vermont.
here? Oh, I see.
Where in Vermont?
All over the state.
yeah.
Wow.
And she said it was the most horrific experiences. But she said every time she knew she was coming to Maine, she would be a mess. I mean, to Vermont. Because
And so, how did she get out? At some point, these women, they may think it sounds cool, and then once they get in it and have been abused more than once, they're probably thinking, how do I get out? But I think their psyche says, if you get out, I'll hurt you. The people that
yeah,
don't
I
know.
mean, the truth is that there's very limited amount of exit services, which is a factor of the equality model.
Yeah.
It is to increase exit services for these young girls and young people that are caught up in this. And so exit services would be anything, trauma care, immediate care. So oftentimes when they're getting out, when they're either rescued or they're choosing to run and risk their life because they'll be beaten,
Right.
like crazy if they're caught. But if they're choosing to walk away, their very first need is just basic. They need a place to live. They need food. It's super simple.
Probably healthcare.
Yes,
Seriously.
exactly. But many states don't offer very much in the way of exit services. And then secondary to that, once they kind of have those basic needs met and they're safely kind of on the ground somewhere, then they start to look at things like rehabilitation, counseling, getting their GED or getting their college degree.
Right.
It becomes more secondary so that they can go on and live a productive life.
Is there moving involved, relocation? Because I'm thinking, like the girl from Maine, that's where she was from, and she probably would try to escape back home, but everybody knows her there, and these
so
guys
oftentimes, I don't know her full story.
Yeah.
But oftentimes, if the FBI or police have been able to rescue a girl or a guy and they have said, yes, I want help, I need to get out, they will oftentimes find safe houses that are not in their area.
Okay.
Because should those girls ever be out on the street and be seen again,
Yeah.
there's risk that these guys would take them back in and
do whatever.
exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes left. I'm just curious if there's anything else we should talk about.
Well, can I turn on my phone? There was a few things
sure.
that I had written down, and I wanted
Yeah.
to make sure that I talked about them.
Because I'm sure there's a lot of us.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to be very non-biased.
So something else that
I hope.
that I wanted to point out was the fact that what they're seeing. So that there is the first ever. It's unprecedented. There's a lawsuit. There are 2 survivors and an attorney in Las Vegas with the assistance of some nonprofits in Nevada. Goodness gracious, in Nevada. And they have filed, and it's been ongoing now for a year or 2, a lawsuit against Nevada for not protecting these women. So the lawsuit is based on those 2 particular women, but at any given time, there are just over 5,000 women, children, men that are being trafficked and prostituted in Nevada every day. Over 5,000. It's so awful. 5,000 lives that are being destroyed every single day.
I lived in New York, and we all knew where the meat market was, where these are young men and men that hang around up there to be picked up. Some of them were so young, and you could they had this sort of outfit that they wore, and you could tell who they were and what they were doing up there, and it was just frightening.
Yeah.
I mean, they're children, they're babies.
Yeah. Right.
Pretty much.
Exactly.
And I'm assuming we have that here, but right now we've got to get to, maybe when they see the women being helped, they'll want to jump in. I think it's very important to have these exit services, as you're calling them.
But what I wanted to say was, so there's this lawsuit happening in Las Vegas, and as they were preparing for this lawsuit, it's just about ready to hit the Ninth Circuit Court. So it's made it up to that point in the legal system, but and they're in the lawsuit, they are basing it on 3 different things. One is the Mann Act, which is a federal act, and it talks about how Las Vegas has been able to advertise across state lines, across the entire country and internationally about, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? That's like a moniker that is known across the world now. And that kind of thing, and any marketing and advertising that they have done to get people to Nevada in order to, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, that kind of mindset is actually in violation of the Mann Act. The Mann Act says that you cannot, again, I'm a layperson paraphrasing, it's basically you cannot entice, market, coerce, any of that kind of stuff for domestic and foreign commercial, sex, whatever.
Trafficking and crossing over state lines.
Yeah. Right. So they're violating, the state of Nevada is violating that act. And then there's another act, and I forget what it's called. It is called the, Victims of Violence and Prostitution Protection Act of 2000. And this, it's violating that act as well. I don't know a ton about that act, but I know that in this webinar, when the attorney was talking about these two violations, he mentioned that one as well. So they're basing it off of those two. Now that's an attorney in Nevada, and now they've been working together with some great colleagues and friends of mine in Washington, D.C., the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Mm-hmm. Now they have an entire law center, and one of their attorneys is going to be doing oral arguments in the Ninth Circuit Court about the 13th Amendment. So they're adding in the 13th Amendment in addition to those two acts as to why the state of Nevada is at fault.
Are we once again in this state putting out a law that is against federal law?
Yes.
I love it when we do that stuff.
Wow.
Because they're still looking at marijuana as a Class D drug, which means it's illegal.
Yeah.
Right? So we're once again just laughing in the Fed's face.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yep. Because these individuals who are brought through legal brothels and they're being pimped out and trafficked, they oftentimes, which I didn't mention earlier, when they had to give away their money, they have to give 50% to the brothel owner, 50% to their trafficker. But really what happens, whoever is housing them, they owe debt each day to pay that room and board.
Right.
So in essence, it becomes like a debt bondage, which is why the 13th Amendment, why it becomes an illegal situation through the 13th Amendment, because you cannot, bondage. Exactly.
Oh, my goodness. I can't thank you enough for taking this on. I have a feeling you're going to find, through Mary Beerworth and others, that you're going to find a lot of people helping you.
Yeah.
So how many women in Vermont do you think are being prostituted?
Oh, I don't think I can make that call. I don't know. I'm
Is it
sorry.
in the hundreds, do you think?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I can only tell you like what the police officer had told me. Last year I think it was around 250 that were rescued, and I don't even know that those were prosecuted. Rescued.
And that's rescued.
But that's
so what's that 20%?
Tip of the iceberg.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. Right. Because not all that are right. If you have little children that are being they're being filmed for CCM, for child pornography. That is sexual exploitation.
You don't even want to talk about mom and dad who are allowing this to happen.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
They should be put away for
There was a case
neglect.
in New Hampshire where these two young children, a brother and a sister, they were like 9 and 7 or somewhere right around there in central New Hampshire. And they would, the kids would come home from school, and it was just such a horrific case. And they would lock their kids up in dog crates immediately. And from the time that they got home until all through the middle of the night, until they went to school the next day, they had men coming in and having sex with their 2 small children.
Oh, how sad that they didn't feel comfortable to tell anybody.
Yeah.
At school or anything.
Yeah. I don't even remember how it got discovered. It may have been through the school system.
Right.
But yeah, I just remember hearing about the case.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So yeah, it does happen.
Does that see something, say something? We better get serious.
Yeah. So Vermont, I would just say, I don't know what camera I should look at, but Vermont.
Right there.
There are things you can do, and those things are, you're hearing stuff now. You can get educated yourself. Just start looking up information on Nevada. Look up the tragedy that's happening in Vermont. In Nevada. Those things will be coming to Vermont. It is a guarantee. You can get people like myself and other people from my organization, other organizations, to come and speak to your organizations, your groups, your schools, your churches, your whatever, your youth group homes, all that kind of stuff. Just don't stay silent, because if we stay silent, we are going to lose a war.
Where is that document? Is that on your website, the Vermont document, Make Vermont Safe?
The package that I sent you?
Package.
Nope, it's on my hard drive.
Okay.
I can get it.
What's your web address?
Great.
Exposeonline.org.
Exposeonline.org.
Yep. EXPOSE online.org. Yep.
Great.
And the Equality Model Now, or equalitymodelus.org.
Great. We'll put that on our website.
Yeah.
Bethanee, thank you very much. I'm just in such admiration for your work. Sad you have to do it. That's what I'm upset about.
Yeah.
This is not making my day. Guy, thank you very much. I'm
you.
sure you're going to follow this up with an article.
Yes, ma'am.
You have to, for sure. Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate it. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.
When I was being trafficked in Vermont, I was a minor. I was 15 years old. And every time when I was in my home in Maine and I knew that we were going to be brought to Vermont, I became frightened because it was the one place where I knew I would be brought that I never knew if I was going to end up coming home or not. The people who purchased me, none of them cared about me. None of them cared about who I was or how old I was or if I wanted to be there. They had an agenda, which sometimes can be brutally violent. I know that other survivors that I have mentored and worked with have been brought to Vermont in many areas, homes, hotels, motels, massage parlors, strip clubs, bachelor parties. I can honestly say that 100% of the women that I worked with, and I've worked with close to 1,000 people, and I have not personally met even one person who has said that they wanted to be there and that this was empowering for them or exciting or something they loved doing. Not one.
When you are talking about prostitution, you are talking about a system of brutal exploitation.
The women that I encounter, they are so beaten, so traumatized.
The vast majority have been abused, manipulated, forced into it, or they're trapped by circumstance.
And those who are being bought are women and girls of color who are mostly poor.
That I was turned out when I was 14 years old. Every time I tried to run away, there was no resources for me. Not a day that I've ever spent in a life of prostitution was okay for me.
And then 99% of the buyers are men.
You can't fully achieve equality between men and women while there is this gender-based form of exploitation.
The problem originates with men. So unless we tackle the issue of demand, there's going to be generation after generation of vulnerable populations who are hurt in precisely this way.
Every single policymaker needs to go to a hobby board where these buyers congregate and read what they have to say. Time and again, they are demonstrating that what they feel they are buying is a commodity, not a human being.
A lot of men are deterred from engaging in prostitution because it's illegal. And if you were to take that illegality out of the equation, you would have an increase in demand. In order to meet that demand, you would have a supply that would need to increase.
A study from the London School of Economics analyzed 150 countries. Wherever prostitution was legal, demand for it skyrocketed and sex trafficking increased.
I was actually trafficked through the legal system of prostitution in Nevada in the brothels. And because of that legal market, the sex trade in Nevada is 63% higher than the next highest state.
Nevada's number 2 in the country for women to be murdered by men, number 6 in the country for women to be raped by men, in the top 10 for youth to be trafficked.
Rhode Island decriminalized prostitution in 1980 and then ended it in 2009. It was becoming a sex tourist destination. It started attracting organized crime, and because the local law enforcement simply couldn't investigate prostitution, the state could not participate in federal investigations of sex trafficking of minors.
Legalization, full decriminalization, these have been tried and they have failed. Both remove restrictions on pimps, sex buyers, and brothel keepers, especially full decriminalization, where there are virtually no regulations so they can exploit with impunity.
So if you're considering legalizing prostitution, my message is talk to survivors of trafficking, talk to people who have walked through this, talk to people who have experienced this firsthand, not just people who are advocating for decriminalization.
People say it's the oldest profession. It's actually the oldest oppression.